Kayaking on my own lake got me a 911 call. Debbie, the pastel-clad HOA queen, thought I was stealing public water. She marched out shouting about public waters while I stood there holding a paddle, not a detonator. You'd think I was draining the lake to bottle and sell it. What started as a peaceful morning turned into an HOA meltdown worthy of its own miniseries. Ever had a neighbor lose their mind over something totally normal? Drop a comment if you've survived suburban theatrics, or just tell me where you're watching from. Trust me, it only gets dumber from here. My name's Scott Turner, and I'm a 35-year-old professional kayaking guide who recently bought this lakeside house specifically for one reason. It came with the only launch ramp on Pine Lake. As someone who creates outdoor adventure videos for a living, having direct water access was a dream come true. The previous owner had installed security cameras around the property after dealing with kayak thieves, and I kept them running because, well, you can never be too careful with expensive equipment. The concrete launch ramp extends into the lake, making it perfect for getting my kayaks in and out of the water safely. What I didn't expect was Debbie Holbrook, my 38-year-old neighbor who seems to think she runs the entire neighborhood association like her personal kingdom. This woman struts around in pastel outfits, clutching a 3-ring binder full of community standards. I'd heard whispers from neighbors about how she'd recently been humiliated after falsely accusing someone of violating HOA rules. But I figured that was just neighborhood gossip. Boy, was I wrong about keeping my head down and staying out of drama. The morning everything started, I was loading my bright yellow sea kayak onto my truck for a client trip when Debbie marched across the street like she owned the place. She planted herself right in front of my launch ramp, hands on her hips, looking like she was about to deliver a lecture to a misbehaving child. I could see her rehearsing what she was going to say, her lips moving silently as she psyched herself up for confrontation. "Excuse me?" she called out in that sing-song voice that immediately put me on edge, "but we need to discuss your usage of community water access. This is a standard community, and we all need to share resources fairly." The way she emphasized standard community made it sound like she was reciting from some holy scripture. I set down my paddle and walked over, trying to keep things neighborly despite the obvious setup for drama, she continued. "I've been watching you come and go with those kayaks, and frankly, it's not fair that you're monopolizing the only water access point in our neighborhood." I pulled out my property deed from my truck's glove compartment, unfolded it slowly, and pointed to the clearly marked boundaries. "Actually, Debbie, this launch ramp is on my private property. I own it, along with about 50 feet of shoreline on either side." Her face went through several colors as she processed this information, starting with confusion, moving through embarrassment, and landing squarely on indignation. She snatched the deed from my hands, studying it like she could will the property lines to change through sheer force of personality. The silence stretched between us as she realized her mistake, but instead of apologizing, I could see her doubling down on her position. "Well, that doesn't matter," she huffed, handing back the deed with obvious reluctance. "This whole community should have access to the lake, and it's selfish of you to keep it all to yourself. I'm going to call the authorities and report you for stealing public lake access." Before I could even respond to this ridiculous threat, she was already pulling out her phone and dialing 911. I stood there, paddle in hand, as Debbie called emergency services over a property line. It would be hilarious if it wasn't real. Officer Jenna Hayes arrived about 15 minutes later, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else dealing with actual crimes instead of neighborhood disputes. She was a no-nonsense woman in her mid-40s who had clearly dealt with Debbie before, based on the way she sighed when she saw who had made the call. After examining my deed and confirming my property ownership through her patrol car's computer system, she informed Debbie that calling 911 for civil property disputes was inappropriate and could result in fine. But instead of backing down gracefully, Debbie started fake crying, drawing the attention of several neighbors who had come out to see what all the commotion was about. I stayed calm throughout the entire encounter, though I found myself gripping my paddle tighter as Debbie's theatrics escalated. As Officer Hayes drove away, Debbie wiped away her fake tears and immediately started live streaming on her phone, rallying the neighborhood for an emergency HOA meeting to deal with Scott Turner, the selfish newcomer who was apparently ruining community spirit. I could see neighbors gathering around her, some nodding sympathetically as she spun her version of events. My eyes narrowed as I watched her performance, wondering just how far she was willing to take this ridiculous feud. The way she positioned herself as the victim, while I stood there holding my property deed and paddle, felt like something out of a surreal comedy, except I was living it. Neighbors I'd barely met were now looking at me with suspicion and disappointment, buying into Debbie's narrative without bothering to ask for my side of the story. The woman who had just called 911 over my legal use of my own property was now painting herself as a reasonable community advocate fighting against my selfish behavior. It was masterful manipulation, and I had to admit that Debbie was skilled at controlling public perception, even when she was completely in the wrong. As the crowd around her grew larger and more sympathetic, I realized that this wasn't going to end with Officer Hayes' departure. Debbie thinks the lake's her backyard, and now she's got an audience for her performance. Will I get shunned by my own neighbors before this drama is over? The Emergency Neighborhood Association meeting was held that very evening in the community center, and I walked in to find about 20 neighbors already seated, all eyes turning to me like I was some kind of criminal. Debbie had positioned herself at the front of the room behind a makeshift podium, her 3-ring binder of community standards open and ready for battle. She wore a crisp white blouse and navy slacks that screamed professional authority, though the effect was somewhat undermined by her overly dramatic gesturing as she spoke. Carmen Simmons, a 30-year-old neighbor known for live-streaming neighborhood gossip, had set up her phone to broadcast the meeting, clearly hoping for some viral content. The atmosphere felt more like a courtroom where I was the defendant in a trial I hadn't known I was part of, facing a jury that had already been poisoned against me. Debbie launched into her prepared speech about how I was ruining the community spirit by hoarding lake access for myself. She painted me as some outsider who had swooped in to destroy their tight-knit neighborhood harmony, conveniently leaving out the part where she'd called 911 over private property ownership. Her voice carried that false sincerity that politicians use when they're trying to convince you that black is white, and I watched several neighbors nodding along with her narrative. She painted me as a selfish newcomer, ignoring the fact that the ramp was legally mine. The way she framed the entire situation made property rights sound selfish and community cooperation sound like the only moral choice, completely ignoring the fact that she had no legal claim to my ramp. Every gesture and inflection was calculated to make her appear reasonable while making me look like a greedy opportunist who didn't understand how their perfect community worked. Her performance was so polished that I wondered how many other neighbors had fallen victim to similar manipulation tactics over the years. When I finally got a chance to speak, I stood up and calmly presented my property deed again, explaining that the launch ramp had been part of the house purchase, and that I had every legal right to control access to my private property. But every time I tried to make a point, Debbie would interrupt with some comment about community values or neighborly cooperation. She had clearly coached herself on how to make me look selfish without directly challenging the legal facts, and her performance was unfortunately effective with the audience. Several neighbors were whispering among themselves, and I could see doubt creeping into their expressions as Debbie's manipulation took hold. The legal documents that should have ended the discussion immediately were being dismissed as technicalities that didn't matter compared to community spirit and neighborly sharing. The more I emphasized my legal rights, the more unreasonable I appeared to neighbors who had been primed to see property ownership as selfishness. The turning point came when Debbie proposed that the neighborhood association should encourage me to allow community access to the ramp, suggesting that property rights shouldn't override community needs. She made it sound so reasonable, so fair-minded, that even I almost felt guilty for wanting to protect my own investment. The way she framed it, I wasn't defending my property rights. I was being a selfish newcomer who didn't understand how their perfect little community worked. She implied that the previous owner had been much more generous with access, though I knew from the purchase documents that they'd had multiple issues with trespassers damaging the ramp. Her bold spin on property rights as a moral crime was almost impressive. The neighbors who should have been supporting basic property rights were instead nodding along with her suggestion that my legal ownership was less important than her desire for lake access. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as community building, and I was losing the battle despite having all the facts on my side. Maxwell Quinn, my 40-year-old neighbor and insurance agent who lived 3 houses down, was the only one who spoke up in my defense. He'd had his own run-ins with Debbie after she blamed him for a broken community sign that had actually been damaged by a delivery truck. Scott owns the property fair and square, he said, standing up despite the hostile stares from other neighbors. If we start ignoring property rights because we don't like the outcome, where does it end? Are we going to demand access to each other's pools and driveways too? But his logic was drowned out by Debbie's emotional appeals about community spirit and working together. The fact that only one person in a room of 20 was willing to defend basic property rights showed just how effectively Debbie had poisoned the well against me. Maxwell's support meant everything to me in that moment. but I could see that even he was fighting an uphill battle against the mob mentality that Debbie had created. His questions about where this entitled thinking would lead were dismissed as missing the point about community cooperation, and I realized that logic and law meant nothing when faced with Debbie's emotional manipulation. By the end of the meeting, Debbie had successfully positioned herself as the reasonable neighbor trying to preserve community harmony while painting me as the selfish outsider threatening their way of life. She announced that she would be posting about the situation on the Neighborhood Association's online group to keep everyone informed about developments. The way she said it made it clear that she intended to wage a social media campaign against me, using the community's own communication channels to isolate me from my neighbors. I felt betrayed, watching people I'd hoped to befriend nodding along with her manipulation. The meeting that should have been a simple clarification of property rights had become a public shaming session where I was the villain for owning what I'd legally purchased. As neighbors filed out, many avoided eye contact with me, already convinced that I was the problem, despite having done nothing wrong except buy a house with a launch ramp. I stormed out of the meeting, clutching my deed, feeling the weight of hostile stares following me to the door. As I walked home, I could hear neighbors whispering behind me, and I realized that Debbie had successfully turned my simple property ownership into a community controversy. That night, I sat on my dock, looking at my kayak and wondering if I'd made a mistake buying this house, if the peaceful lake access I'd dreamed of was going to become a constant source of conflict. My eyes lingered on my paddle as I wondered whether I'd even be able to enjoy kayaking anymore, without feeling like the neighborhood pariah. Maxwell caught up with me as I was unlocking my front door, placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Don't let her get to you, Scott. Debbie's been trying to control this neighborhood for years, and she's made enemies out of half the people here. She doesn't speak for all of us, even if she acts like she does." His support meant more than I could express, but I could tell that even he was worried about how far Debbie might be willing to push this conflict. Debbie's got the neighborhood on her side for now, but she doesn't know I'm planning something that'll turn this whole situation around. The next morning, I discovered that Debbie had planted a professional-looking no kayaking sign right next to my launch ramp during the night. The sign was obviously fake, printed on cheap plastic with no official markings, but it was positioned strategically to make anyone approaching the ramp think that kayaking was prohibited. The audacity of placing a fake prohibition sign on my private property made my blood boil, but I forced myself to think strategically instead of reacting emotionally. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was Debbie attempting to fraudulently claim authority over my property by posting fake official signage. I could see her plan clearly. If people thought kayaking was officially prohibited, they'd blame me for ignoring regulations rather than recognizing my property rights. I carefully removed the sign and stored it in my garage as evidence, then drove to the hardware store to buy several cans of bright red spray paint. If Debbie wanted to play games with signage, I was going to make sure there was no confusion about who owned what. I spent the afternoon painting a large red circle around the entire launch ramp area, along with bold letters spelling out Pilot Launch Zone NA, Neighborhood Association Uninvited. The red paint was impossible to miss against the gray concrete, and anyone approaching the ramp would immediately understand that this was private property with restricted access. Every line of red paint marked a boundary I wouldn't surrender. The bright color served multiple purposes. It clearly delineated my property, sent a message to Debbie that I wasn't backing down, and created a visual reminder to the neighborhood that this wasn't community property, despite her claims. What I didn't realize was that Debbie had been watching from her window with her phone ready, filming everything as I painted the ramp. Within an hour of finishing my work, she had posted the video to the Neighborhood Association's online group with a caption about how I was vandalizing community property and destroying the natural beauty of the lake. She carefully edited the footage to make it look like I was defacing public property, leaving out any context about her fake sign or my property ownership rights. The post generated dozens of comments from neighbors expressing outrage at my destructive behavior. Her video editing skills were surprisingly sophisticated, creating a narrative that made me look like an aggressive vandal rather than a property owner protecting his rights. The comments section quickly filled with condemnation of my extreme response and calls for the association to take action against my antisocial behavior. Without the context of her fake sign installation, my red paint job looked like the actions of an unreasonable person who couldn't handle normal community discussions about shared resources. But I had an ace at my sleeve that Debbie didn't know about. Those security cameras that the previous owner had installed weren't just for show, and they had captured everything that happened during the night, including Debbie sneaking onto my property to plant her fake sign. The footage was crystal clear, showing her creeping around my launch ramp in the darkness, positioning her prohibited sign, and then retreating back to her house. I had time-stamped evidence of her trespassing and attempting to fraudulently claim authority over my private property. The irony was delicious. While she was filming me responding to her provocation, she had no idea that I had filmed her initial crime. The security footage showed her checking over her shoulder multiple times as she placed the sign, clearly aware that she was doing something wrong, but hoping she wouldn't get caught. Her body language in the video was that of someone committing a deliberate act of trespassing and fraud, not someone making an innocent mistake about property boundaries. I spent the evening editing the security footage into a clear, undeniable timeline of events, starting with Debbie's midnight trespassing and ending with my legitimate response to protect my property rights. When I posted this evidence to the neighborhood group, along with a copy of my property deed, the response was immediate and dramatic. Neighbors who had been criticizing my red paint suddenly started questioning Debbie's version of events. The most satisfying part was watching the comment thread evolve as more neighbors realized they'd been manipulated by Debbie's selective storytelling. People started asking why she hadn't mentioned the fake sign in her original post, why she'd been on my property in the middle of the night, and whether she had any legal authority to post prohibition signs anywhere. Maxwell jumped into the comments early, pointing out that trespassing to place fake official signs was actually illegal, while my painting on my own property was completely within my rights. Even some of Debbie's strongest supporters began distancing themselves from her position once they saw the security footage. The narrative completely flipped from Scott is vandalizing community property to Debbie is trespassing and posting fake signs. I printed multiple copies of my property deed and hand-delivered them to every house on my street, along with a polite letter explaining the situation and my rights as a property owner. Most neighbors were actually apologetic once they understood the facts, admitting that they'd only heard Debbie's side of the story and hadn't realized the launch ramp was on private property. The red paint that had seemed so aggressive in Debbie's video suddenly looked like reasonable property marking when viewed in the proper context. Several neighbors even complimented me on standing up for my rights against Debbie's manipulation. The door-to-door campaign was exhausting but effective, allowing me to present my case directly without Debbie's editorial interference. But as I checked the neighborhood group that evening, I could see that Debbie wasn't done yet. She had posted a new message claiming that my aggressive response to her simple request for community access showed that I was an unreasonable neighbor who couldn't be trusted. She was already pivoting her strategy, trying to make this about my character rather than property rights, and I could tell she was planning something even more dramatic for her next move. My eyes gleamed as I hammered permit property signs around the ramp perimeter, my hands steady with purpose as I established clear boundaries. The woman who had tried to frame me as a vandal was now exposed as a trespasser and fraud, but I knew her pattern of escalation meant this was far from over. I've got ironclad proof that Debbie's been lying and trespassing, but knowing her desperate need for control, what dirty trick is she cooking up next? Within hours of posting the security footage, the entire neighborhood dynamic shifted as people realized how thoroughly Debbie had manipulated them. Comments flooded in from neighbors apologizing for jumping to conclusions and expressing outrage at being deceived by her fake sign stunt. Even Carmen Simmons, who had initially live-streamed support for Debbie's position, posted a follow-up video acknowledging that she'd been wrong to take sides without knowing all the facts. The tide of public opinion was turning so quickly that I almost felt sorry for Debbie, until I remembered how willing she'd been to destroy my reputation with lies and manipulation. The transformation in the comment section was remarkable to watch in real time, as neighbor after neighbor realized they'd been played by someone they'd trusted to represent community interests. Those who trashed my red paint now applauded it. The security footage had done more than just exonerate me. It had opened everyone's eyes to Debbie's true character and methods. But Debbie wasn't the type to accept defeat gracefully, and her response to being exposed was exactly what I should have expected from someone willing to call 911 over property ownership. She went nuclear with an Oscar Welvy live stream from her perfectly decorated living room, complete with tissue box strategically placed within reach. She claimed that my security footage was somehow an invasion of her privacy, that posting it publicly was harassment, and that she was being slandered by malicious neighbors who didn't understand her good intentions for the community. The shift from tearful victim to manipulator was whiplash-inducing. Her ability to completely reinvent herself as the wronged party, despite being caught red-handed, was both impressive and deeply disturbing. What Debbie didn't know was that Carmen had continued filming, even after her official live stream ended, capturing the moment when Debbie thought the cameras were off and dropped her tearful act entirely. The contrast was shocking. 1 second she was dabbing delicately at her eyes and speaking in a wounded whisper about community betrayal. And the next she was snapping at her husband for making noise in the background and checking her appearance in a hand mirror. Carmen caught it all. The fake tears, the practiced expressions, and most damning of all, Debbie's real voice as she strategized about her next move against that kayaking bastard. The transformation from weeping victim to calculating schemer happened so quickly it was like watching someone remove a mask. Carmen's accidental footage revealed the mechanical nature of Debbie's emotional manipulation, showing her literally turning her victim persona on and off like a light switch. The glimpse behind the curtain was devastating to Debbie's credibility, proving that even her most convincing emotional displays were carefully crafted performances designed to manipulate public sympathy. The fake tears performance might have worked if Debbie had stuck to playing the victim, but she couldn't resist escalating the situation even further. 2 days after my security footage went viral in the neighborhood group, she called 911 again, this time claiming that I had threatened her during our encounter at the launch ramp. Officer Jenna Hayes arrived looking even more irritated than before, especially when she realized she was dealing with the same property dispute she'd already resolved. When I showed her the security footage of Debbie's midnight trespassing, Officer Hayes warned Debbie that false police reports were a serious matter and that continued misuse of emergency services could result in fines and charges. The look on Officer Hayes' face when she realized this was Debbie's second baseless call about the same resolved issue was priceless. Her professional composure barely concealed her frustration with having to waste time on manufactured drama while real emergencies waited for attention. Debbie's attempt to weaponize law enforcement against me had backfired spectacularly, turning her into a problem for the police department rather than making me look like a criminal. I decided to fight fire with fire by installing a large QR code sign at my launch ramp that linked directly to a web page featuring the 911 call recordings, my property deed, and the security footage of Debbie's fake sign installation. Anyone curious about the neighborhood drama could scan the code and get the complete unedited story instead of relying on Debbie's version of events. The QR code was subtle enough to avoid looking vindictive, but effective enough to ensure that the truth was easily accessible to anyone who wanted it. Neighbors started scanning it during their daily walks, and soon everyone had seen the evidence for themselves. The technology's solution was particularly satisfying because it turned Debbie's own social media tactics against her, providing a permanent, uneditable record of her behavior that couldn't be spun or manipulated. The QR code became a neighborhood talking point, with people mentioning how clever it was to make the truth so accessible. The breakthrough moment came when Carmen posted her secretly recorded footage of Debbie dropping her tearful act and revealing her true manipulative nature. The video went viral within the neighborhood group, shared and reshared as people marveled at the stark difference between Debbie's public persona and private behavior. Comments ranged from shock at her deception to anger at being manipulated, and several neighbors admitted they felt foolish for falling for her performance. The video was so damning that even Debbie's closest allies began distancing themselves from her position. Maxwell took advantage of the shifting sentiment to post a detailed timeline of Debbie's escalating behavior, from the initial 911 call through the fake sign installation to the fraudulent harassment claims. He included links to all the evidence and pointed out that every single one of Debbie's claims had been proven false through documentation or video evidence. His post was methodical, factual, and devastating in its complete dismantling of Debbie's credibility. At first, I felt defeated, watching Debbie's tearful performance gain sympathy from neighbors who hadn't seen the full evidence, my confidence shaking as she twisted the narrative once again. But as Carmen's secret footage spread and the truth became undeniable, I found myself smirking with satisfaction as public opinion shifted dramatically in my favor. The woman who had tried to destroy my reputation with lies and fake tears was finally being exposed for exactly what she was. A manipulative neighborhood tyrant who had been getting away with her behavior for far too long. The transformation from feeling like a pariah to watching the entire community turn against my tormentor was incredibly vindicating, especially knowing that it was her own behavior that had caused her downfall. Carmen's accidental recording had done more damage to Debbie's reputation than any deliberate attack could have achieved, because it showed her authentic personality when she thought no one was watching. The mask had finally slipped and everyone could see the calculating manipulator behind the concerned neighbor facade. Debbie's been completely exposed as a fraud, but knowing her desperate need for control and pattern of escalation, what humiliating move is she planning next? Just when I thought Debbie couldn't sink any lower, she produced a witness to back up her harassment claims. A woman who lived several blocks away and claimed she'd seen me aggressively confronting Debbie near the launch ramp. This woman appeared at the next neighborhood association meeting with a prepared statement about how I'd raised my voice and made threatening gestures, painting a picture of intimidation that would have been convincing if it weren't completely fabricated. She spoke with obvious nervousness, glancing at Debbie for reassurance as she delivered her testimony. The timing of her sudden appearance, right after Debbie's credibility had been destroyed by Carmen's footage, was too convenient to be coincidental. Her stiff delivery screamed scripted desperation. Carmen pulled me aside after the meeting with some crucial information that she'd been hesitant to share. This witness wasn't just some random neighbor. She was the same woman who had helped Debbie frame another neighbor for vandalism 6 months earlier, claiming to have seen them damage community property when they'd actually been out of town. That incident had caused months of conflict before security footage from a nearby business proved the accused neighbor's innocence, but by then the damage to their reputation was already done. Carmen had kept quiet about the witness's involvement in that frame job, but seeing the same pattern repeat itself with me was too much for her conscience to bear. The revelation that Debbie had a history of using the same fake witness for multiple frame jobs was both shocking and illuminating. It explained how she'd been able to destroy other neighbors' reputations in the past, and suggested that I wasn't her first victim of systematic character assassination. Debbie's desperation was becoming more obvious as her previous tactics failed, and she was clearly willing to escalate to outright perjury to regain control of the narrative. She organized what she called a peaceful demonstration at my launch ramp, leading about a dozen neighbors down to the waterfront with her phone, recording everything for another one of her social media productions. The group stood on the public street adjacent to my property line, chanting about community access and sharing resources, while Debbie live-streamed the event as proof that the neighborhood supported her position against my selfish hoarding of lake access. The demonstration was carefully choreographed to look spontaneous, while actually being a calculated attempt to apply public pressure through manufactured outrage. Debbie positioned herself as the leader of a grassroots movement, fighting against my unreasonable property rights, complete with signs that made it look like the entire community was united against me. Watching neighbors protest outside felt surreal. I watched from my window, feeling under siege in my own home by people who had believed Debbie's lies despite all the evidence I'd provided. The protesters were technically on public property, so I couldn't legally make them leave, which added to my sense of helplessness in the face of Debbie's campaign. But anger can be a powerful motivator when channeled correctly, and I decided to fight back with the same tools Debbie was using against me. I found old text messages between Debbie and her fake witness from the previous frame job incident, which Maxwell had forwarded to me after recognizing the woman from Carmen's description. The messages clearly showed Debbie coaching her witness on what to say and when to say it, including specific details about timing and witness positioning that proved their collaboration was planned in advance. Armed with this evidence, I created a parody video titled Debbie's Rulebook Volume 1, mimicking her earnest community standards presentations while exposing her pattern of manufacturing fake witnesses and false accusations. The video used her own speaking style and dramatic gestures to present a mock guide to neighborhood manipulation, complete with screenshots of the coaching text messages. I included sections on how to frame your neighbors and the art of fake tears, all delivered in Debbie's signature condescending tone. The parody video struck the perfect balance between entertainment and exposure, making people laugh while simultaneously opening their eyes to exactly how they'd been manipulated. Within hours, neighbors were sharing it throughout the online group and adding their own commentary about Debbie's behavior. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with neighbors creating memes based on quotes from the video and sharing their own stories about Debbie's past manipulations. The community that had briefly rallied behind her was now turning her into a neighborhood joke, and the psychological impact of becoming a meme was clearly devastating to someone who had built her identity around being taken seriously as a community leader. The fake witness, who had seemed like such a serious threat just hours earlier, was now exposed as part of a pattern of fraud, and the protesters outside my house had quietly dispersed once the text message evidence made it clear they'd been manipulated again. My hands were blazing with determined energy as I edited the parody video, channeling my frustration into creative revenge that would expose Debbie's methods while entertaining the neighbors she'd tried to turn against me. The transformation from feeling desperate and isolated to creating content that had the entire neighborhood laughing and sharing was incredibly empowering, and I could see that Debbie's reign of manipulation was finally coming to an end. My video's absolutely blowing up with shares and comments, but knowing Debbie's desperate need for control, how will she try to dodge this complete exposure of her manipulation tactics? The morning after my parody video went viral throughout the neighborhood, I posted the text message evidence showing Debbie's coordination with her fake witness, and the response was swift and decisive. Neighbors who had been on the fence about the whole situation finally saw the undeniable proof of deliberate deception, and even the witness's credibility crumbled when people realized she'd been caught lying for Debbie before. Carmen immediately announced she would be live streaming a neighborhood update to set the record straight, and I could see Debbie's support network completely evaporating as former allies distanced themselves from her proven pattern of manipulation and false accusations. The text messages were particularly damning because they showed the premeditation behind the false testimony, proving that this wasn't a misunderstanding, but a deliberate conspiracy to frame me for harassment I'd never committed. Neighbors who had been sympathetic to Debbie's victim act were now horrified to realize they'd been supporting someone who manufactured witnesses and coached false testimony. Carmen's stream sealed Debbie's fate. She ranted that the neighborhood was too stupid for her vision. Her mask didn't just slip during this live stream, it completely fell off, revealing the narcissistic tyrant underneath the concerned neighbor persona. Carmen's decision to keep the cameras rolling during Debbie's breakdown provided the neighborhood with undeniable evidence of who they'd really been dealing with all this time. Officer Jenna Hayes made an unscheduled visit to my house that afternoon, not because of another false report from Debbie, but to inform me that this was Debbie's 6th baseless 911 call in the past 3 months. She explained that the department was considering filing charges for misuse of emergency services and wanted to make sure I understood my options for pursuing harassment charges if Debbie's behavior continued. The fact that law enforcement was now taking Debbie's pattern of false reports seriously was both validating and concerning. Validating because it confirmed that her behavior was genuinely problematic, but concerning because it suggested she might escalate even further when cornered. Officer Hayes also mentioned that other neighbors had been filing complaints about Debbie's behavior, suggesting that her pattern of manipulation and intimidation extended far beyond our property dispute. The revelation that I wasn't her only victim made me feel less isolated, but it also highlighted how long Debbie had been terrorizing the community without facing consequences. I decided to take a more positive approach to resolving the situation by erecting a large, professionally made sign at my launch ramp that read, "Debbie's Drama-Free Zone, Peaceful Kayaking Only." The sign was humorous enough to get laughs from neighbors while making it clear that I wasn't interested in continuing the conflict, and it served as a daily reminder that Debbie's manipulation tactics had been thoroughly exposed and rejected by the community. The bright yellow sign matched my kayak perfectly and became something of a neighborhood landmark, with people taking selfies in front of it. The sign represented a turning point from defensive responses to confident assertion of my rights, and its cheerful tone helped diffuse the tension that had been building in the neighborhood for weeks. The turning point came when Carmen made a public apology during one of her live streams, admitting that she'd been completely wrong to initially support Debbie's position and that she should have verified the facts before taking sides in the dispute. She revealed that Debbie had actually threatened to make her life difficult if she didn't continue supporting her against me, which was the final straw that convinced Carmen to expose everything she knew about Debbie's manipulative behavior. Her apology was genuine and heartfelt, and it opened the floodgates for other neighbors to come forward with their own stories about Debbie's threats and intimidation tactics. The revelation that Debbie had been threatening neighbors for years created a wave of anger and disgust that finally broke her hold over the community. People who had been afraid to speak out against her began sharing their experiences, creating a picture of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind her community standards facade. The community response was swift and decisive. Neighbors began creating and sharing memes based on my parody video, with Debbie's face photoshopped onto various templates and her quotes turned into punchlines about neighborhood drama. Someone created a Spot the Debbie game, where people could identify manipulation tactics in everyday situations, and others started using phrases from my video as inside jokes when discussing community issues. The psychological impact of being turned into a neighborhood meme was clearly devastating to someone who had built her entire identity around being feared and respected as a community leader. The woman who had tried to control everyone through intimidation and manipulation was now the subject of jokes and ridicule, and her power over the neighborhood had completely evaporated. I felt triumphant as I hammered the drama-free zone sign into the ground next to my launch ramp, paddle in hand as a symbol of the peaceful lake access I'd fought to protect. The woman who had tried to steal my property rights through lies and manipulation was now completely isolated from the community she'd claimed to represent, and justice felt sweeter than I'd ever imagined. Debbie's reputation is completely destroyed and she's become a neighborhood joke, but with her pattern of escalation and threats, is she hiding some final card to play? The neighborhood association called an emergency meeting specifically to address what they diplomatically termed recent community conflicts, but everyone knew it was really about forcing Debbie to face the consequences of her behavior. The room was packed with neighbors who had been following the drama, and the energy was completely different from that first meeting, where Debbie had manipulated everyone against me. This time she sat alone in the back row, completely isolated, while community leaders took turns reading statements about appropriate neighbor behavior and the importance of honesty in community disputes. The association's board had reviewed all the evidence, including my security footage, the text messages between Debbie and her fake witness, and the recordings of her false 911 calls, and their unanimous conclusion was damning. The association's board voted unanimously to require a public apology for her disruptive and dishonest behavior. Watching Debbie stand up to deliver that forced apology was incredibly satisfying, even though her eyes burned with spite as she read from a prepared statement about misunderstandings and learning from mistakes. She never actually admitted to lying or manipulating anyone, but the mere fact that she had to publicly apologize while everyone knew the truth was justice enough for most of the neighborhood. She read the apology through clenched teeth. The forced humility was perhaps more devastating to her ego than any other punishment could have been, since her entire identity was built around being the neighborhood authority figure. I decided to celebrate the resolution by hosting a free kayak day at my launch ramp, inviting every neighbor except Debbie to come try out kayaking on Pine Lake. The response was overwhelming, with families bringing children excited to get on the water for the first time, and the atmosphere was everything I had hoped for when I bought the house. Maxwell brought his camera to document the event, and watching kids laugh as they paddled around while their parents relaxed on my dock made all the conflict worthwhile. The community that Debbie had tried to turn against me was now gathered on my property, celebrating the very thing she'd tried to take away. Ironically, her fight to dominate brought everyone together. Without her. But the biggest surprise came when Maxwell approached me with a printout of an email he'd found in the Neighborhood Association's archives, sent anonymously to the previous owner of my house 6 months before I bought it. The email was a masterpiece of character assassination, claiming that the seller was destroying property values with their selfish lake access hoarding, and suggesting that concerned neighbors were considering legal action if they didn't do the right thing and sell to someone more community-minded. The writing style and specific phrases were unmistakably Debbie's, and the timestamp showed it was sent just weeks before the previous owner had suddenly decided to sell below market value. The revelation that Debbie had essentially forced the previous owner into selling their dream home for less than it was worth added a whole new dimension to her manipulation and greed. It wasn't just about controlling the launch ramp. She had actively tried to force people out of their homes to get what she wanted. Maxwell and I spent an hour crafting the perfect flyer titled, "I Got 911 for Kayaking on My Land," which included highlights of Debbie's failed attempt to force the previous sale and her subsequent harassment campaign against me. The flyer spread throughout the neighborhood like wildfire, and the final piece of Debbie's manipulation puzzle clicked into place for everyone who read them. Neighbors began connecting dots they'd missed before, remembering Debbie's sudden interest in waterfront properties and her comments about improving the community through better ownership. Several people came forward with stories about Debbie's attempts to pressure them into selling their homes or giving her access to their private amenities, painting a picture of someone who had been systematically trying to control and exploit the entire neighborhood for years. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Debbie didn't just want to use other people's property, she wanted to force them out so she could acquire it for herself. The climax of my story came during the free kayak day celebration, when I looked across the lake to see Debbie standing alone on the public shore, staring silently at the festivities she'd tried so hard to prevent. She was completely ostracized now, her reputation destroyed and her manipulation tactics exposed, reduced to watching from a distance as the community she'd claimed to represent celebrated on the property she'd tried to steal. I paddled out onto the calm water with my camera, capturing footage for a new video with my owned paddle defended. Defend a sign visible in the background, surrounded by happy neighbors enjoying the lake access I'd fought to protect. The woman who had called 911 over my legal use of my own property was now a cautionary tale about the consequences of neighbor harassment, and the entire community had rallied around rejecting her toxic influence. As the sun set over Pine Lake that evening, I sat on my dock, feeling genuinely content for the first time since moving to the neighborhood. My eyes were calm on the water as neighbors called out their thanks and children begged their parents for just 5 more minutes in the kayaks. And I realized that sometimes fighting for what's right leads to outcomes better than you ever imagined. The launch ramp that had started as a personal amenity had become a community gathering place, though with a strict no Debbie's policy that everyone understood and respected. What do you think Debbie's plotting next from her isolation? Comment your guesses about her next desperate move.